Captain, do you know where we are?
कुछ नहीं दिखाई दे रहा. I can't see anything. Attempting to land, going blindly.
Trivandrum, Kerala. The pilots and passengers of this Jet Airways flight from Qatar to India are now in a desperate fight for survival. Terrible weather and the lack of ILS has made it impossible for the pilots to spot the runway. The pilots have tried to land this plane not once, not twice, not thrice, but 6 times already. They have been circling the airports for well over 2 hours. And now they are critically low on fuel. They literally have just 10 minutes of fuel left. In zero visibility, they are so close to the ground that the GPWS warnings start blaring.
Terrain, pull up.
And if they cannot land this plane in the next 10 minutes, there is a very real possibility that they'll crash in the heart of Trivandrum city. How did they let things get so bad? This is the real story behind the Bollywood movie Runway 34. It's a story about how one poor decision by one person can put the lives of 150 people in danger of imminent death. This is the story of Jet Airways Flight 555. It's August 17th, 2015, and this is Hamad International Airport in Doha, Qatar. A Jet Airways Boeing 737-800 is preparing for a 4-hour flight to Cochin International Airport in the southern Indian state of Kerala. The pilots rostered for today's flight had flown this plane from Cochin to Doha the previous day, and they've had more than 24 hours to rest between the two flights. The Doha to Cochin sector is one of Jet Airways' most popular routes, and today's flight was no different. This plane was carrying 142 passengers and 8 crew members on board. The plane used today is a Boeing 737-800, the world's most widely used narrow-body aircraft. It is powered by 2 GE CFM56 turbofan engines, which consume approximately 500 kilos of fuel every 10 minutes. Now keep this in mind as this story is about to turn into a major fuel nightmare. The flight time is 4 hours and it's flown by 2 pilots. The captain was pilot flying and the first officer was pilot monitoring. The captain is 40 years old and he had around 6,700 hours of total flying experience, with most of his experience being on the type. The first officer is much younger. He's 25 years old. He's only had around 1,500 hours of total flying experience and he's had about 600 hours on the type. Notice the steep discrepancy in the age and the relative experience of the 2 pilots. This power gradient will soon become an issue in this story. Now this flight was a night flight and it's scheduled to depart at around 10:30 p.m. local time. The entire flight was going to occur in the window of circadian low. It's the time between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., the time when people are usually sleeping, where the body's alertness drops. You would have noticed this when you try to work late into the night. During this period, the pilots experience drowsiness and their decision-making skills and alertness might be compromised. The crew met up 2 hours prior to prepare for the flight. When they received the weather report for Cochin, they realized that the weather report was created 10 hours ago, and they didn't have a more recent one. So they had to base their entire planning on this dated information. And that report indicated that Cochin had a good weather with visibility of 4,000 meters, with a mild 5-knot crosswind, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, and broken clouds at 9,000 feet. Their chosen alternate was Bengaluru. Now, although closer airports like Thiruvananthapuram and Kozhikode existed, the cities on the western side of the Western Ghats tend to have similar weather due to the effects of the Western Ghats mountain range. Since an alternate airport needs to have better weather than your primary destination, they chose Bengaluru, which is on the other side of the mountains. And Bengaluru had a visibility of 8,000 meters, wind at 290 at 10 knots, scattered clouds at 1,200 feet, and broken clouds at 8,000 feet. They chose Coimbatore as their secondary alternate.
So on this channel, we discuss serious aviation incidents, and it's easy to see how therapy could help people who have gone through that traumatic journey. But therapy is not just for those with clinical mental health issues. It's for anyone who needs support, guidance, and a way to work through their tough times. It takes courage to open up about your mental health, and I'm here to open up about my journey. So I am a content creator, and I've been producing content for the past 12 years. You've seen my videos, and we've interacted on the comments. What you don't see is how lonely this job is, especially when times are tough. Back in 2017, there was a period of about 8 months where every single project that I was working on was a complete and utter failure. Nothing was working. Everything that I tried flopped. It put me in a state of mental doubt. I was questioning my abilities and I had no clear path forward. And for me, that's where therapy made a huge difference. And if I hadn't gotten therapy at that time, my business, this channel, these videos would not exist. I got in-person therapy, but I want to talk to you about an accessible alternative that aligns with these experiences. And that is today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp has helped 4 million people live happier and healthier lives. Getting therapy from BetterHelp is simple. You go to their website and you answer a few questions, and they'll match you with a licensed therapist specializing in your needs, usually within 48 hours. And if you're still wondering how therapy can help you, it's about understanding yourself better. It's about developing coping mechanisms, and it's about coming up with a plan to navigate through these life's challenges. And BetterHelp offers a convenient way to access therapy through phone, through video, or through messaging from the comfort of your home. If my story resonates with you, or if you're going through your own challenges, consider checking out BetterHelp. Using my link, betterhelp.com/Wyngx, you'll get 10% off on your first month of therapy. Remember, taking the first steps towards mental health care is a sign of strength, not weakness.
They calculated how much fuel they'd require for this trip. There are guidelines and regulations that govern how much fuel needs to be on board the plane before takeoff. And here's how that's calculated. You start by computing the kilos of fuel required to taxi the plane at both the origin and at the destination. For 18 minutes of taxi, they added about 216 kilos of fuel. To this, they added the trip fuel. The trip fuel is the amount of fuel required from accelerating down the runway at Doha, flying all the way to India, and then to exiting the runway at Cochin. The trip fuel was 11,112 kilos, 4 hours and 7 minutes of total fuel burn. To this, they added 14 minutes of contingency fuel to give them a buffer in case something goes wrong along the way. For example, an unplanned rerouting by ATC to avoid thunderstorms. Jet Airways mandated the contingency fuel to be 5% of the trip fuel. To this, they added the alternate fuel of 2,178 kilos to give them about 44 minutes of flying time to get them to Bengaluru airport in case they were unable to land at Cochin. And to this, they added the final reserve fuel. The final reserve fuel is the amount of fuel required to fly for 30 minutes at 1,500 feet over their alternate airport, in this case, Bengaluru. And for this flight, that number was calculated to be 1,128 kilos. They also added 105 kilos for the APU burn as required by the airline. This brought the absolute minimum fuel to 15,295 kilos. Due to the possibility of poor weather over Cochin, the captain considered that additional hold time may be required and hence added an additional 750 kilos of fuel for 19 minutes of hold. So in all, they took on about 16,100 kilos of fuel, giving them a total engines on time of 6 hours and 13 minutes. Okay, now let's get back to Doha, Qatar. The passengers have boarded the plane and the plane is ready to depart. They pushed back at 1920 UTC and they departed Doha at 1937 UTC, headed to Kochi, India. A 4-hour flight was ahead of them. 3.5 hours later, they arrived near India's west coast and they got in touch with Kochi ATC. The time is now 4:30 a.m. IST. The ATC informed them that the latest weather at Kochi was visibility at 3,500 meters in hazy conditions with few clouds at 1,500 feet and scattered clouds at 8,000 feet. This wasn't too different to what the pilots were expecting to hear, and so they continued their approach towards Cochin. Now let's get familiar with Kochi Airport. This is a single runway airport with runways 0927. The active runway this morning was 27. The approach for runway 27 requires the pilots to fly over the runway to a VOR, fly out east at a heading of 097, and then turn around to a heading of 271 to position themselves for a landing. The plane arrived overhead at Kochi Airport at 5:20 a.m. and they were cleared by ATC to approach runway 27. And at this time, they had 4,844 kilos of fuel available. This is going to be their first landing attempt for the day. The ATC reached out with updated weather information. The visibility had reduced to 3,000 meters and it was trending lower. There was fog all over the runway and on the approach path. The plane entered the cloud layer and the captain's forward visibility dropped dramatically. They couldn't see anything outside the window. As they continued towards the runway, they checked their approach charts. The minimum visibility for this runway was 650 meters and the decision altitude was 320 feet. If they couldn't see the runway at 320 feet, they'll have to go around. The crew continued with the approach, hoping to see the runway in due course. They extended their flaps and brought the gear down. As the plane continued to descend down the glide slope, the weather continued to worsen. As the plane dropped below 1,000 feet, nothing was visible. They then hit their decision altitude. The runway was nowhere to be seen. So, at 256 feet, they pressed the toggle switch, applied max power, and executed their first go-around. The time is 5:28 a.m. India time. The pilot flying then followed the missed approach procedure and joined the holding pattern over Cochin. The fuel on board dropped to 4,699 kilos. The minimum fuel required for a diversion to Bengaluru was 3,306 kilos. While holding, they checked what the weather was like at their planned alternates, Bengaluru and Coimbatore. The crew also requested the ATC to provide them with weather for Trivandrum. So why Trivandrum? The captain reasoned that if they decided to divert to Trivandrum instead of Bengaluru, that would give them an additional 20 minutes of holding time at Cochin, maybe allowing them to do 2 more approaches if needed. Since Trivandrum wasn't in their original plans, the first officer checked the NOTAMs for that airport. The NOTAM stated that the ILS at Trivandrum Airport was down for maintenance. This meant that the crew needed good visibility at Trivandrum if they were to land there. The visibility at Trivandrum was reported to be 3,000 meters with clouds at 1,500 feet. This was above the minimums required for a VOR approach, and so the captain was confident that he could land the plane if they decided to divert there. Whilst they were in their holding pattern, 2 Air India Express planes were on final approaches into Cochin. The first one landed and reported sighting the runway at 1,400 feet. The second one attempted to land, but they couldn't see the runway at their decision altitude. They reported clouds as low as 600 feet and informed the ATC that the visibility had dropped to 2,400 meters. The ATC relayed this information to the Jet Airways crew. Given that the first Air India Express plane was able to land, the Jet Airways crew decided to begin their second attempt. As the plane descended and reached its decision altitude, just like the first attempt, they still couldn't see the runway. So, they executed their second go-around for the day at 5:47 a.m. local time and entered the holding pattern again. The fuel on board had dropped to 3,919 kilos. The minimum fuel required to go to Bangalore was 3,306 kilos. A third attempt to land at Cochin would cost them around 800 kilos of fuel, placing them under the minimum fuel for Bangalore. So, if they were to divert to Bangalore, they should divert now. But remember, the captain was wanting to go to Trivandrum to gain some additional holding time at Cochin. The captain discussed this plan with the first officer. However, the first officer was concerned that since the ILS wasn't working at Trivandrum, and since the visibility at Trivandrum wasn't better than Cochin, they might not be able to land at Trivandrum either. He was also concerned that the presence of haze and the rising sun might make visibility worse. The captain assured him that if Trivandrum got worse, they could then divert to Coimbatore as their alternate, as it was closer to Cochin. But curiously, they never checked the weather for Coimbatore. Remember the power gradient in the cockpit that I mentioned? It's starting to play a factor here. The crew then informed the ATC that they were redesignating Trivandrum as their alternate. At the same time, a Kuwait Airways plane attempted to land but executed a go-around because it couldn't spot the runway either. And based on updated information from the Kuwait plane, the ATC informed the Jet Airways crew that the visibility was now 1,500 meters with low clouds at 400 feet. The weather had further deteriorated. The ATC now asked the Jet Airways crew to state their intentions. The captain informed the ATC that he wanted to attempt to land at Cochin one more time, and if that landing was unsuccessful, then he'd divert to Trivandrum. The plane now spent an additional 30 minutes holding over Cochin, burning fuel all along. The ATC then advised them of the latest weather. Tempo visibility reducing to 1500 meters in mist and low clouds now at 400 feet. The weather had further deteriorated. And at this time, the weather is worse than either of the previous two attempts. No plane has landed at the airport in the past 30 minutes. But despite this, the captain decides to begin the third attempt to land. Landing gear down, flaps out, minimus reached, they still couldn't see the runway. So, they executed a third go-around for the day. The ATC now vectored them to intercept the 180 radial for Cochin and to climb to 4,000 feet. This heading would get them to Trivandrum. Their current fuel on board is 2,644 kilos. The minimum fuel for Bangalore is 3,306 kilos. Bangalore was no longer an option. The minimum fuel for Trivandrum was 2,614 kilos. They had no room for error in Trivandrum. Those additional 30 kilos gives them 1 extra minute of flying time. Also, because they were heading towards Trivandrum, Coimbatore was no longer an option as well. Whilst they were on their way to Trivandrum, they were cleared to climb to flight level 210. 5 minutes later, Trivandrum ATC informed Cochin ATC that the visibility at Trivandrum had dropped to 1,500 meters and asked them to relay this to Jet Airways 555. Cochin ATC acknowledged it, but failed to pass this information on to the Jet Airways plane. The crew were flying towards Trivandrum, unaware of the deteriorated conditions there. The weather at Trivandrum was now no different to that of Cochin. Time to now familiarize ourselves with Trivandrum Airport. The Trivandrum Airport is located in the heart of the city, just a couple of kilometers inland from the Arabian Sea. And like many Kerala airports, Trivandrum has a single runway, runway 1432. And the active runway this morning was runway 14, approaching from the north. At 6:30 a.m. local time, as they neared Trivandrum, the crew got in contact with Trivandrum ATC. The ATC relayed the current weather, visibility at 1500 meters, wind at 290, scattered clouds at 1500 feet and at 2500 feet. The ATC cleared them for the VOR approach into runway 14. The 1500 meter visibility was now an issue because the minimus to begin a VOR approach in Trivandrum was 2100 meters. The minimum decision altitude is 650 feet. This meant that legally, the pilots cannot begin this approach at this runway in the current conditions. But remember, the fuel continues to be an issue. The crew then asked the ATC whether they had high visibility lighting because they wanted to use a workaround called converted meteorological visibility. When the approach lights are much brighter, the pilots can see the runway from much further away. And in those cases, the pilots can use this table to convert the reported visibility into a converted MET visibility to obtain a higher visibility number. However, this conversion can and should only be done if high visibility lighting exists at the airport. But the ATC responded to the crew that the runway only had basic lighting and had no high visibility lighting. But despite the lack of such lighting, the captain made the calculations and obtained a converted MET visibility value of 2,250 meters. This was higher than the 2,100 meters required for the VOR approach. So he checked the box and continued towards Trivandrum. When the plane was 25 nautical miles from Trivandrum Airport, the captain realized that they were too high to begin the approach and requested for a right 360 orbit to reduce the height. The crew spent time and fuel completing this turn to reduce their altitude. This unplanned maneuver further reduced the available fuel and sent the plane into a minimum fuel state. Whilst not yet an emergency, a minimum fuel call signifies that an emergency situation could arise if further delays occur. The ATC then vectored Jet Airways 555 for a straight-in approach to runway 14 with a visibility of 2,000 meters. At 6:50 a.m. local time, the plane approached the minimum decision altitude, but once again, they were unable to spot the runway. They executed their fourth go-around for the day. The fuel on board dropped to 1,324 kilos. The final reserve fuel is 1,300 kilos. When the plane goes under final reserve, the crew needs to declare an emergency. And an emergency opens up all airports and all approaches for them. After 2 minutes, the fuel dropped below 1,300 kilos and the first officer made the emergency call to the ATC. Things are going to get very interesting. With their options reducing, the captain requested permission from the ATC to conduct a visual approach into runway 14. Now, to do a visual approach, you need clear visibility of the runways and of the approach path. This captain has just done an instrument approach and he couldn't see the runway. But he was now requesting permission to do a non-instrument approach in zero visibility. The reason he's asking for this is because in visual approaches, you can take a much tighter path, reducing the amount of time required to land. But under the current visibility conditions, this is a significant gamble. At this point of time, the pilots had been flying this plane for more than 5 hours, right through the window of circadian low. And with almost no fuel in the plane, panic is setting in, and the crew are making some questionable calls. But they are almost out of options. Since this is an emergency plane, the ATC cleared them for a visual approach into runway 14. The crew made a right-hand turn and stabilized the plane at 1,000 feet. This is much lower than the usual altitude to begin a visual approach. On the downwind leg, as they flew abeam the threshold for runway 14, they informed the ATC that they are initiating a right-hand turn to land. The ATC was concerned that this was way too close for them to be able to turn into final, and they asked the crew to confirm that they could actually see the runway. The crew continued to descend, and they turned the plane towards the airport. However, during this approach, the crew were not in visual contact of the runway at any time. They turned into final blindly. And by the time they sighted the runway, they realized that they were way too high to be able to land the plane. So, they had to initiate their 5th go-around for the day. Things are going to get even worse. The fuel depleted to 898 kilos. They had around 15 minutes of flying time left before they would completely run out. The captain then again requested the ATC for another visual approach into runway 14. The ATC informed the crew that the visibility remained unchanged and it was still at 2,000 meters, asking them to confirm whether they wanted to try immediately. But with just 15 minutes of fuel left, they had to attempt it again. They initiated their 6th landing attempt. Since they were too high on the previous approach, the crew compensated by descending to 1,000 feet and further descending to 500 feet on the base turn. This is very low for a standard visual approach. On the base leg, they were still not able to make contact with the runway, and once again turned blindly into final. When they spotted the runway, this time they were too low and they were further to the right. The captain manhandled the yoke and turned it to the left. The plane banked so hard that they got a bank angle warning. They were too close to the runway to stabilize the plane in time, and they had to conduct their 6th go-around for the day. The fuel is now at 662 kilos, and they have about 10 minutes of flying time left. With almost no options left, the captain climbed the plane to 700 feet. They realize that they don't have time to do a full circuit to approach runway 14 anymore. The captain informs ATC that he intends to do a 180-degree turn to land on the opposite runway, runway 32 instead. Like it or not, this is their final landing attempt. Because if they don't land the plane this time, they will run out of fuel. And since they are flying over the heart of the capital city of Kerala, they'll inevitably crash in a populated area. But the plane is still inside the clouds. The captain can't see anything, irrespective of which runway he's landing on. Without being able to see where they are, they blindly start descending down to the ground. The ground proximity warning,
Terrain, pull up,
blares in the cockpit. They were so low that the captain was able to see houses and people on the ground, but the forward visibility was still poor, and the runway was still not in sight.
terrain, pull up.
The first officer inhibits the warning. They disconnect the autopilot. Captain, do you know where we are?
कुछ नहीं दिखाई दे रहा. I can't see anything. Attempting to land, going blindly.
As they fly closer, they can see a vague outline of the runway over to their left. They are once again not aligned. They bank hard to the left. They are just 50 feet above the runway at this point. The approach lights become visible, and they finally find themselves somewhat aligned with the center line. The captain forces the nose of the plane down. And at 7:10 a.m., they finally land on runway 32. As the plane rolled down the runway, the final fuel was 349 kilos. They had around 5 minutes of fuel left. They then taxied and parked the plane at the gate. A few hours later, the weather improved. They fueled up, the passengers boarded the plane, and the same crew took off again towards Cochin. The final report attributed the cause to an absence of company policy about the number of approaches and go-arounds that a crew can attempt at an airport. It also attributed it to a lack of policy around the redesignation of an alternate airport during inclement weather. The poor decisions made by the crew to redesignate Trivandrum as an alternate airport when the airport had similar weather and worse navigational aids were also highlighted. The AIBB also recommended that low fuel scenarios and decision-making training be added to the training sessions for pilots. Now, in poor weather, just because you've landed doesn't mean you're safe. As this crew and passengers on United 1448 found out when they found themselves on the middle of an active runway with a massive jet hurtling towards them. Click here to watch that video and I'll see you there.